So before I get into the absolute devastation we discovered, I'll share some good news. Even with a nationwide shortage of darn near everything, I was able to get my hands on some new tires. I actually was hoping that I'd be able to use the old tires for some burnout meets or something, but once we got them off and looked at them, there was absolutely nothing left of these things. So I loaded the new and old ones up and drove them down to Bobo and Brad's like I always do to get mounted and balanced. I dropped them off in the morning, and they were ready to pick up after work, so that was one thing off the list. The other exciting news is that the new rear shocks came in. I knew these were needed, but you'll see later on in the video just how badly these were needed. With easy stuff out of the way, it was time to get down to the more labor-intensive things, namely getting this rear end out so it can get down to the shop for service and new rear gears put in. After some discussion, we realized that the 410 gears in there is really limiting the mile an hour for the van, and with the torque and the new converter, it just doesn't need that steep of a gear. So we're going to put 373s in it, and that should help a lot. It should also make it much more highway friendly, which is a bonus. The whole van really needs to go down to the trans shop because I still need to have the torque converter, manual valve body, and trans brake put in, but I want to get the underneath of this thing cleaned up. This is a show vehicle as well as a race vehicle, and the underneath just does not look that way. Pulling the drive shaft out with dual drive shaft loops is really an ordeal. Note to self in the future, you gotta jack the rear end up to get this thing out. Not only does this thing just need to get out of the way, we're going to have it painted body color. Dad actually dropped it off to the paint shop already. As well as the extra bracing and drive shaft loops will be body color, with the main part of the body being a dark smoke gray. With the drive shaft off and out of the way, it was time to start taking the slapper bars off in preparation of getting the leaf springs and rear end dropped. Little did I know this would be the last easy part of this disassembly. I know Caltracs are probably ultimately the way to go, but I think I can do really well with these slapper bars, especially with the new leaf springs and everything else that's going to be replaced down here. You'll see why. I figured it was a good idea to at least loosen up the U-bolts while everything was still connected. Take a close look at the angle of those things. These were not quite as tight as I felt they should have been. That front leaf spring bolt, on the other hand, wasn't going anywhere. So I gave myself a little break and unbolted the shocks. These shocks were mounted completely vertical, almost like a coilover would be, and the top bolts are actually inside the van. So we knew we were going to have to pull a little bit of the interior apart, but we made ourselves an access. I had doused everything in PB Blaster a couple of weeks ago, and I was hoping that would have time to penetrate. A little bit of heat, and I thought I'd be able to just pull this off so easily. Maybe just a little more heat. Piece of cake. So far, everything was going completely according to plan. Just had to get these front bolts out. A little bit of breaker bar action. Little bit of breaker bar action with a third hand pushing. Little bit of breaker bar action with a big wrench for leverage. Super easy. I mean, the nut spins were basically done, right? Just gotta knock this out. No problem at all. This time, this time, this time. Why won't you move? Kill it with fire. At this point, the theory was to just melt all the rubber packed around the bushing. And we are just going to accept defeat. We started fresh the next morning and got the rear shackles off, if nothing more than a moral victory. But the front bolts were still mocking us. So we did the only logical thing. Work on getting these shocks out. And that's when we made a pretty amazing discovery. Why buy double-eyed shocks when you can just fabricate them, right? We pulled the rear end out the back with the front leaf spring still hooked up, and once we got it out, you could see where the U-bolts had been rubbing on the tubes. It was clear that everything had really been moving around back there. When I did that nitrous hit and it said it felt like the whole rear end was rattling out of the vehicle, it pretty much was. Almost as an admission of guilt, the left leaf spring just fell apart. This whole thing was one trans brake release away from absolute catastrophe. So with a left leaf spring that now identifies as a monoleaf, we thought we might be able to have some leverage to finally get these front bolts out. Once we got both leaf springs out next to each other, we had more telltale marks of everything moving around. Obviously these springs are no good anymore, and I'm just going to get a set of new ones that have a regular eye, because even with polyurethane bushings, the van leaf springs have this weird oval that's just packed in rubber, and it's just not a good setup for drag racing. Remember how I mentioned the U-bolt angle? Check out how tweaked these things were. They didn't even line up with the holes in the mounting plates they came out of. So, foolishly believing that all of our terrible discoveries were behind us, we started cleaning up the rear end. I want to have it painted before it goes down to the shop because I've got that new cover and gasket, and I just think it looks so much nicer on a new fresh paint instead of trying to paint around it after the fact. I'm definitely thankful for a random 70-degree sunny day in Northeast Ohio in the beginning of March. It makes no sense, but I'll take it. With the rear end getting cleaned up pretty good and almost ready for paint, I made another discovery. Broken welds on the axle tube. So rather than finish painting it and getting it loaded up to go down to the shop, we loaded it up to get the welds fixed. At some point I'll be able to actually get to the original plan of scraping and painting the underneath of this van, so I covered up the rest of the vehicles in the garage in preparation for that. Don't worry, it's coming. Before I headed out to get the rear end re-welded, I figured I could clean up some of this small stuff so that it was at least ready for paint the next day. I'm very fortunate to have awesome friends in my circle, and as soon as I sent Bill pictures of the rear end weld, he said he could take care of it right away. I actually planned on leaving it there for a couple of days, but once he saw what needed to be done, he said he could take care of it while I was there, which was amazing, and I can't be more grateful. With the rear end all cleaned up and a good strong weld on that tube, I could finally get to putting some primer on it. I brushed on some thick Rust-Oleum primer as a base coat. Dad took over all the priming and painting duties after that, so I could finally focus on getting underneath that van and scraping things down. I got the rear section where the original gas tank would be cleaned up and scraped down enough, and I really needed to see some progress just to keep myself motivated, so I ended up brushing some primer on that area just to get something done. This will end up getting another coat of primer before it gets painted, but at least it looks like something. Dad got the rear end painted in the final gray color. This is what the whole underneath of the van will be, with the exception of the accents that are in body color and the slapper bars and brackets that are all in a satin nickel. It really has a cool metallic to it, and I'm so excited to see this right next to the stainless exhaust. So we're finally at a point where the rear end can go down to the trans shop, get new gears, get checked out, and be on our way.